She offered a stranger $40 to save her dignity. He accepted. Neither of them knew that one ridiculous lie was about to destroy everything and rebuild something neither of them had dared to want. If you've ever smiled through a humiliation so complete it left marks on the inside, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The garden smelled like money and old grudges. Nyla Brooks could identify, both from 20 feet away, which was precisely the distance she kept between herself and the main tables where her family gathered beneath white linen canopies strung with Edison bulbs and climbing jasmine. The Brooks family did not do anything halfway when it came to appearances. They rented the entire back acre of the West Haven estate every time an occasion demanded witnesses, and Cousin Priya's engagement party was exactly the kind of occasion that demanded a crowd large enough to make the humiliation feel communal. Nyla stood near the hydrangea border with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, wearing a green wrap dress that her mother had already commented on twice, once when she arrived, once when Aunt Lorraine pretended not to recognize her from across the lawn. The dress was fine. The dress was better than fine. But when you have spent 30 years being the wrong shape inside a family that only values one specific silhouette, you learn to doubt everything that belongs to you, including the clothes on your back. She was 30 years old. She owned a bakery on Clement Street that her grandmother had built with her own hands and her own savings in 1987. She worked 60-hour weeks. She paid her 3 employees on time, every time, even during the months when the margin between profit and disaster was thin enough to read through. She had rebuilt the customer base after a rough stretch post-pandemic, redesigned the display cases, sourced her butter from a small dairy farm 2 hours north of the city. The bakery was real. The bakery mattered. The bakery was the only thing in her life that had never once made her feel small. Her family treated it like a consolation prize she'd given herself after failing at everything else. Nyla. Her mother appeared at her elbow, arriving the way she always did, quiet, purposeful, trailing the faint scent of Chanel No. 5 and low-grade anxiety. Carol Brooks was 62 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades managing the distance between what the family said out loud and what it actually meant. She was good at it. She had made it an art form. You're standing near the flowers again. The flowers are nice? You're hiding near the flowers again. Nyla took a sip of water she didn't want. I'm observing. Carol pressed her lips together. She had Nyla's same wide-set eyes and the same slight tilt to her chin that made both of them look stubborn even when they weren't trying. Your Aunt Lorraine set the tables. I didn't have anything to do with the seating. Nyla went very still. What about the seating? Carol looked briefly toward the main tables, then back at her daughter, and in that single glance, Nyla read everything. The apology that wasn't quite an apology. The guilt that hadn't quite hardened into action. The particular kind of maternal love that showed up after the damage was done and called itself helpless. Table 4, Carol said softly. Near the fountain. Nyla turned and looked. Table 4 was set slightly apart from the adult seating. It had a cheerful yellow tablecloth. It had small balloon centerpieces in gold and white. It had 8 chairs filled with children between the ages of 5 and 11, currently in the process of dismantling their bread rolls and flicking ice from their water glasses. It was the children's table. She was the only unmarried woman in the Brooks family over the age of 24. Aunt Lorraine had been making note of that fact for 6 years, ever since Nyla turned 24 without producing either a ring or a serious prospect, and had been finding increasingly creative ways to communicate the family's collective disappointment. Last Christmas, it was seating her beside Cousin Derek's 8-year-old during the toast. The year before, it was pointedly asking whether she'd given up on the idea of love in front of 14 people. This was different. This was not passive. This was a declaration. She did that on purpose, Nyla said. Nyla, she did it on purpose, Mom. Don't. She kept her voice level. She had practiced keeping her voice level. You developed that skill when you learned that losing your composure was the thing your family circled for months afterward like evidence. I'm not going to sit at the children's table. I know. I'll talk to Lorraine. She's already in a mood because Priya's fiancé's family arrived late, and I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm telling you, I'm not sitting there. Carol reached out and touched her arm briefly, the way she did when she ran out of language. Then she drifted back toward the main tables, and Nyla stood alone in the hydrangea border with her untouched water and the growing certainty that she needed air that wasn't circulating through this particular garden. She started toward the side path that curved around the estate toward the parking lot, nodding at distant cousins and second cousins by marriage who acknowledged her with the polished, distracted warmth of people who didn't quite know what to do with her. She passed the main champagne table and nearly made it to the gate when she heard the voice. Nyla. She knew that voice before she turned around. She had trained herself to recognize it the same way you trained yourself to recognize the sound of a car backfiring in the dark. Involuntarily, in the back of the skull, where the nervous system logged things that had once hurt you. Ethan Holloway was standing 10 feet away in a cream linen suit that had cost more than Nyla's monthly refrigeration bill. He was 33, still rangy and handsome in the particular way of men who had always been told so, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and a mouth that had learned early how to shape itself into whatever a room needed. He had been Nyla's boyfriend for 2 years, starting when she was 22, and had ended things by explaining, gently, carefully, with what she later recognized was practiced fluency, that he needed someone who wanted the same kind of life. She had understood that to mean someone with better prospects. She had been right. He was currently engaged to her cousin Priya. Hey. He said it like they were old friends catching up at a casual reunion, like the last 3 years hadn't involved her quietly rebuilding every assumption she'd made about her own worth. You look good. Ethan, how's the bakery? She looked at him. She let herself look, really look, and she registered the practiced ease with which he held his champagne glass, the way his eyes moved across the garden rather than staying on her face, the faint performance of friendliness that coated everything he said the way lacquer coated cheap furniture. She had once mistaken that performance for warmth. She had been young and in love and not particularly careful, and she had paid for it in ways that were hard to itemize but easy to feel. It's great, she said. Good, that's good. He paused. Priya's really excited you're here. She wanted the whole family. Nyla understood this was not a conversation and had never intended to be one. It was territory marking. It was Ethan Holloway standing in his cream linen suit in a garden he was about to belong to by legal right and letting her know that he had won whatever competition she had not realized she was losing. She felt the old familiar pull, the one that said, respond, defend, explain yourself, and she ignored it. Tell her congratulations from me, Nyla said, and walked toward the gate. The parking lot at West Haven Estate was separated from the garden by a long pebbled path flanked by boxwoods trimmed into neat geometric shapes. The afternoon sun was starting to angle westward, cutting long shadows across the gravel, and the sounds of the party muffled themselves as soon as Nyla cleared the hedgerow. She stopped walking and stood in the relative quiet of the empty lot and breathed. In. Out. The dress was fine. The bakery was real. Ethan Holloway was her cousin's problem now, and she did not have to feel anything about that if she chose not to. She chose not to. She was choosing, actively, with the deliberate effort of someone who had done this enough times to know how much it cost. What she had not accounted for was the moment she'd have to go back inside, because she would have to go back inside. Not going back inside meant letting Aunt Lorraine win in a way that would become family legend, retold every Christmas for the next decade. Nyla Brooks, who ran away from Priya's party. Neela Brooks, who couldn't handle sitting at the children's table. Neela Brooks, who never did figure out how to hold herself together. She could not give them that. But she also could not walk back into that garden and sit down at table 4 with the balloon centerpieces and the small humans dissecting their bread rolls, and smile, and endure it, because something had broken open in her chest in the last 10 minutes, and she didn't have the spackling to cover it before the next wave hit. She needed something, a buffer, an exit, a story that would hold long enough for her to get through the next 3 hours without bleeding on anyone. Her mouth moved before her brain approved the decision. What she needed was a boyfriend. The thought arrived with the specific clarity of truly terrible ideas, clean, complete, and utterly without a plan. She didn't have a boyfriend. She hadn't dated anyone seriously in 2 years. The closest thing to a romantic prospect in her recent life was a regular customer named Marcus, who ordered the same almond croissant 3 times a week and had, twice, told her she had a nice smile. That was not a boyfriend. That was barely a subplot. But if she walked back into that garden with someone at her side, someone real, someone present, someone who could be pointed at and said, that's him, that's my person, then table 4 became irrelevant. Then Aunt Lorraine's seating chart became a gesture aimed at someone who no longer existed. Then Ethan Holloway in his cream linen suit became nothing more than background noise. She just needed to find a human man in the next 4 minutes. The parking lot was not crowded. Most guests had arrived early, and the valets had long since parked the cars in the overflow area beyond the lot's main row. There were perhaps 12 vehicles visible, ranging from a modest silver sedan near the entrance to a progression of increasingly expensive cars deeper into the lot. Nyla's own car, a 7-year-old Honda with a cracked dashboard mount she kept meaning to replace, was near the middle. At the far end, parked with a kind of deliberate separation from everything else, was a black Mercedes, the long kind, the kind that signaled either corporate transportation or someone who had decided that restraint was beneath them. It gleamed in a way that suggested it had been cleaned within the last hour. Standing beside it, not doing anything in particular, was a man. He was Korean, she thought, though she registered this without certainty, the way you register details about strangers from a distance. Tall, broad in the shoulders. He wore a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that meant it had been made for his body specifically, not selected from a rack and adjusted. He wasn't on his phone, he wasn't pacing. He was simply standing with his hands loose at his sides, looking at the middle distance with an expression that communicated nothing except the complete absence of urgency. Nyla stood 30 feet away and stared at him. He was objectively the kind of man who could walk into a garden party and make a statement by existing. He had that quality, the one that was hard to name and easy to recognize, where stillness read as authority rather than absence. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he was standing in a parking lot instead of inside. She didn't have time to care about either question. She walked toward him. This was the part, she would think later, where a reasonable person would have paused, would have assembled some version of a plan, would have considered the variables. Nyla was, in most areas of her life, a reasonable person. She ran a business. She managed vendors and inventory and 3 employees with complicated schedules. She was not reckless. But she had just been seated at the children's table by her own family, and Ethan Holloway had looked at her like she was something he had already finished with, and she was 30 years old and she was tired in a way that had very little to do with hours slept and everything to do with the accumulation of small cruelties that people who loved you found ways to deliver. She walked up to the stranger by the black Mercedes and stopped 3 feet away. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and very calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't paying attention, the opposite of that. The calm of someone who was paying complete attention and had decided that nothing he was likely to see would be worth reacting to. It was slightly unnerving. She proceeded anyway. "Hi," she said. "I know this is going to sound bizarre." He waited. "I need someone to come inside that party with me and pretend to be my boyfriend for approximately 1 hour. She kept her voice steady. She was good at that. "I can pay you $40 and—" She reached into her small crossbody bag and pulled out what she found there. A bakery loyalty card. 6 punches already on it. You'd only need 4 more for a free coffee. The man looked at the loyalty card. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment that stretched past comfortable into something else. Nyla had prepared herself for laughter. She had prepared herself for him to take a step back and politely excuse himself or impolitely tell her she was out of her mind. What she had not prepared herself for was his actual response. 1 hour, he said. His English was unaccented and precise, the voice of someone who had learned the language thoroughly and used it carefully. 1 hour, maybe 90 minutes if things run over. What would I be required to do? She blinked. Mostly just stand next to me. Act like you know me. If people ask questions, you can be vague. You don't have to say much. He considered this. It was not a long consideration, but it was real. She could see him running something behind those dark, calm eyes, some internal calculation she didn't have access to. Then he said, "All right." She stared at him. "Seriously? You asked. I agreed." He tilted his head very slightly. "Do you want me to reconsider?" No, I... She recalibrated. "What's your name?" "Taejun," he said. "Kang Taejun. I'm Nyla. Nyla Brooks." She extended her hand and he shook it once, cleanly, with a grip that was neither aggressive nor deferential. Just present. "Okay, so we've been together about 4 months. We met through a mutual friend. You work in..." She gestured vaguely at his suit, his car, the general aura of expensive restraint. "Finance, something like that." I can work in finance, Taejun said. Great. Okay. She exhaled. I'm going to be honest with you. This family is a lot. If you want to back out at any point, I said I'd agreed. She searched his face for irony and found only that same unruffled attention. He was not joking. He was not mocking her. He was simply a man who had said he would do something and appeared to have no interest in reversing course. Nyla Brooks had made a lot of decisions in her life under pressure. Some of them had been good. Some had been the kind she spent years unpacking in quiet moments at the bakery's prep table before sunrise. This one, she thought, was either going to be fine or it was going to be the story she told for the rest of her life in therapy. She said, "Okay, let's go." They walked back up the pebbled path together, and she noticed that he adjusted his pace to match hers without being asked. Small thing. She noticed it anyway. The moment they passed through the garden gate, she felt the change. Not in her, in the atmosphere around her. It was the way heads turned, not a sudden dramatic swivel, more like the slow involuntary reorientation of a room towards something that had changed. Taejun moved through the garden with the same quality he'd had in the parking lot, that absolute lack of performance, and somehow that made him more visible rather than less. Nyla felt the shift in the air around her and thought, this might actually work. Her cousin Marcus, not the croissant Marcus, the family Marcus, who was 27 and spent most parties sending real-time updates to his group chat, clocked them from the champagne table and went very still in the way of someone seeing something they hadn't expected. Aunt Lorraine was the more important test. She was holding court near the rose arbor, exactly where she always positioned herself, close enough to the center of the party to enforce her presence, far enough to suggest she was above mingling. Lorraine Pemberton Brooks was 67 years old and had married well twice, and she wore both facts with the serene self-satisfaction of someone who had concluded that the rules of merit applied to other people. She had silver hair swept up with architectural precision, a champagne flute she never seemed to actually drink from, and eyes that cataloged everything in a room according to a hierarchy she'd developed and refined over decades. Those eyes found Nyla, and then they found Taejun, and something moved across Lorraine's face. Not warmth, not surprise, but a kind of rapid internal recalibration that she smoothed over quickly. She was too practiced to let it show for long. "Nyla," she said, crossing toward them with her champagne flute at the perfect angle. "We were wondering where you'd gotten to." "I was in the parking lot," Nyla said, "waiting for Taejun." She said his name naturally. She'd practiced it twice in her head on the walk up, and it came out clean. Lorraine looked at Taejun with the particular attention she reserved for people who needed to be assessed. Taejun looked back at her with the particular attention he apparently gave everything, which was complete and without anxiety. And the combination of her assessment and his non-reaction produced a silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt longer. "Kong Taejun," he said, and offered his hand. He did not embellish. He did not produce a business card or a title or any of the social lubricant that people usually deployed in rooms like this. He simply gave his name and waited. Lorraine shook his hand. "Lorraine Pemberton Brooks. I'm Nyla's aunt. Are you a colleague of hers?" "No," Taejun said. Another silence. "We've been together about 4 months," Nyla said, stepping in. "He was going to meet me here. His schedule was uncertain this morning, so I wasn't sure he'd make it." She glanced at him, and he looked back at her with the kind of calm attention she was beginning to understand was simply his resting state, and somehow it read exactly right. Not adoring, not performative. The specific kind of ease that came from people who didn't need to prove anything to each other. Lorraine's eyes moved between them. Nyla had expected skepticism. She got something else. A slight recalibration, the narrowing and widening of possibilities, the visible operation of social arithmetic. Whatever Lorraine was adding up, she didn't share the result. "Well," she said. "How lovely." The words were correct. The tone carried a question she wasn't asking yet. "We should find you both seats. The children's table placement was a miscommunication. I'm sure we can adjust." "Of course," Taejun said pleasantly. Lorraine moved away to manage the adjustment, and Nyla became aware that her heartbeat had not returned to normal since the parking lot. She stood beside Taejun in the rose arbor's shadow and thought about the next 80 minutes with the specific anxiety of someone who had started a fire and was only now remembering she hadn't thought through an exit. "That was good," she said quietly. "You were nervous," he said, equally quiet. "I'm not." She stopped. He wasn't being cruel. He was stating it as a fact, the way you stated that it was warm or that the champagne table was to the left. Yes, I'm nervous. Don't be. You know, that sentence has never once worked on anyone. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like a smile's shadow. Stay near me, he said. I'll follow your lead. She looked at him. This stranger in the perfectly fitted suit who had agreed to accompany her into the social minefield of her family's judgment for $40 and a partially punched loyalty card. And she thought, this is insane. This is completely insane. But she nodded, and when they moved toward the main tables together, his hand came to rest briefly at the small of her back. Just a touch, barely pressure at all, and every head that had been quietly tracking them across the garden turned with a new kind of attention. Nyla squared her shoulders and walked through the middle of it. The main tables were arranged in a loose horseshoe shape. Priya and her fiancé, Derek Whitmore, held the center with the practiced glow of people who had spent months rehearsing being the focus of a large room. Priya was beautiful in the particular way of women who had been told so consistently since childhood, with confidence that settled on her skin like an additional garment. She was Lorraine's eldest daughter. She had a law degree she no longer used, and an Instagram presence built around curated aesthetics and aspirational domesticity. Nyla had no real grievance against her beyond the Ethan of it all, which wasn't even Priya's fault. Priya hadn't known the history in full, or had chosen not to ask, which was a different kind of fact. Ethan sat beside her, cream linen suit still immaculate, one arm draped along the back of Priya's chair with the proprietary ease of a man marking territory he was confident in. He was in mid-conversation with someone across the table when Nyla and Tae-jun arrived at the main seating area. He glanced over. He registered Nyla. He registered Tae-jun. His arm did not move from the back of Priya's chair, but his posture changed, just slightly. The shoulders, the angle of the jaw, the imperceptible recalibration of someone encountering something they had not included in their model of the afternoon. Nyla sat down across from her cousin Marcus, who had given up any pretense of not staring. Okay, Marcus said, low and intent, leaning across the table the moment Tae-jun stepped away briefly to take a phone call 10 feet distant. Who is that? Tae-jun, I told you I was bringing someone. You texted that you might bring someone. You used the word possibly. You included a shrug emoji. Marcus. Nyla. He leaned closer. That man looks like the final scene of an action movie. He's in finance. He is absolutely not in finance. Marcus, I need you to be supportive right now. I am being supportive. Being supportive means telling you that man parked a car worth more than my apartment, and he's standing over there taking a phone call with the energy of someone who makes actual decisions with actual consequences. And you're telling me, drop it. Marcus sat back. He looked at her with the particular expression of a cousin who had known her for 30 years and had learned which battles to defer. Okay, he said. I'm supportive. I'm extremely supportive. I'm aggressively supportive. He picked up his wine. But if this becomes a story, I want to be in it. Tae-jun returned and settled into the chair beside Nyla with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. He looked around the table once, cataloging without appearing to catalog, and then he looked at the small plate in front of Nyla. Bread roll, untouched, butter still wrapped in its paper. And then he looked at the main food stations across the garden where the catering spread had been fully laid out. You haven't eaten, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. I've been a little busy. Tell me what you want. She blinked. You don't have to. Tell me, he said simply. Not demanding, not pressing, just the specific patience of someone who had offered a thing and was waiting for acceptance without needing to amplify the offer. The salmon thing, she said, the little skewers, and the rice paper rolls on the left side. He stood up and crossed toward the food station without any appearance of effort or performance, and Nyla watched him go and felt Marcus's eyes on the side of her face like a warm spotlight. Finance, Marcus said. Finance, Nyla confirmed. Sure, said Marcus. Tae-jun came back with 2 plates, one for her, built exactly to what she'd described with a few additions she hadn't requested but found herself immediately wanting, and a smaller plate for himself. He set hers in front of her and then sat and ate with the same self-contained ease as everything else, and Nyla ate something for the first time that afternoon and felt her blood sugar begin to stabilize, and with it some portion of the panic she'd been running on since the parking lot. It was around this point that Aunt Lorraine came back with an announcement. She stood at the head of the main tables with the champagne flute she never quite drank from and made the kind of entrance that wasn't an entrance because she'd never left. She'd simply redistributed her weight until she was the center of the composition. "We'll be doing a small reception tradition," she said, "for the happy couple and our guests of honor. We'd love to see the younger couples join Priya and Derek on the lawn for the first dance." She said it pleasantly. She was looking at Nyla when she said it. Nyla understood immediately. It was not an invitation. It was a trap with pleasant staging. Because everyone at that table, everyone in this garden who knew the family, knew that Nyla Brooks had arrived to every family event for the last 6 years unaccompanied. They had watched her decline wedding dances and anniversary toasts and every other occasion that required a partner. They had watched Lorraine watch her decline these things with the low satisfaction of a woman whose thesis about her niece was being regularly confirmed. Now Lorraine was giving Nyla a stage. Either Nyla declined and confirmed the lie, or Nyla danced with the stranger she'd found 40 minutes ago and risked everything falling apart in front of the entire family. Marcus had stopped pretending to drink his wine. Priya and Derek were already moving toward the cleared section of lawn where a string quartet was arranging itself. Other couples began to rise, the kind of gradual, social momentum movement that eventually carried everyone along. Nyla turned to Tae-jun. He was already looking at her. She did not ask. She was not sure she could produce words in the right order. He said very quietly, "Do you know how to dance, or am I leading?" She breathed. "You're leading." He stood up and offered his hand. She took it. They walked out onto the lawn together in the amber late afternoon light, and the string quartet began something slow and deliberate, and Tae-jun put one hand at her waist and kept her right hand in his left, and they began to move. He knew what he was doing. That was the first thing she processed. He was not performing competence. He had it. The specific body knowledge of someone who had learned this at some point and retained it. He led without pulling, adjusted without correcting, kept the space between them exactly right. Not intimate, not distant. The specific distance of two people deciding something about each other. "You're doing it," he said, very quiet, near her ear. "Doing what?" Shaking. She was. Barely. Just a fine tremor she'd thought wasn't visible. "I'm not nervous." "You are," he said, and there was no criticism in it. "It's all right." She looked at him. At this close distance, she could see things she hadn't registered before. A small scar along his left jawline, very faint, old enough to have gone silver. The way his brow held the slightest furrow that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with something he was carrying that she didn't have access to. He was not, she thought, a simple man. He was not a man who moved through the world without weight. Whatever history lived behind those eyes, it was not nothing. "Why did you say yes?" she asked. "In the parking lot." He considered. They were still moving, and around them other couples occupied the lawn, and the string quartet played something with a minor key running through its center. "You asked honestly," he said finally. "That's it?" "Most people," he said, "do not ask honestly. They arrange things. They construct approaches. You walked up to a stranger and told him exactly what you needed." She let that sit for a moment. "I told you I'd pay you $40. "Yes. That's not exactly dignified." "No," he agreed, and there was that shadow of something at the corner of his mouth again. It was better than dignified. The dance continued. The garden lights had begun to come on. The Edison bulbs in the canopies and the small lanterns placed along the path edges. And the quality of the afternoon was changing, tipping from day into the particular warmth of early evening when everything went amber and edges softened. Nyla felt the tremor in her hand slowly quiet. She noticed at the edge of the lawn that Ethan was watching them. Not the general watching of someone observing a party tableau. The specific, focused attention of someone who was running calculations and not liking the results. He had his champagne glass, but he'd stopped drinking from it, and his posture had the subtle rigidity of a man encountering something he hadn't planned for. Priya, beside him, was watching Nyla and Tae-jun with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile, not warm. Somewhere in the complicated middle of someone who was at her own engagement party and finding it slightly less centered on her than expected. Nyla returned her attention to Tae-jun. "My aunt is going to ask you questions," she said. "At some point, she'll approach when she thinks she has an angle." "What kind of questions?" "What you do, how we met." Why you're serious about me instead of someone more, she paused. She'll try to suggest that you could do better. Taejun's expression did not change. And how should I respond to that? Honestly, however you want. I just want you to know it's coming. She paused. She's going to be looking for the weak point in the story. What is the weak point in the story? Nyla looked at him. That you're not real. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face, not the shadow of the smile this time, something quieter. Something she didn't have a name for yet. I'm real, he said. She didn't answer. The music continued. They kept dancing. When the first song ended and they moved back toward the tables, Nyla noticed the shift in the garden's atmosphere the same way you notice a change in weather before the rain. Something in the quality of attention around them, the conversations that paused, the eyes that tracked. She had arrived as the unmarried one, the bakery woman, the family's recurring proof that not everyone turned out the way they were supposed to. She was returning from the dance floor as something else. She didn't know what yet, but the shape of it was different. Aunt Lorraine materialized from the direction of the rose arbor. She had repositioned herself. The champagne flute was gone. She was moving with the specific energy of a woman who had decided that small talk was over and something more direct was required. Taejun, she said, arriving beside him with a smile that was deployed rather than felt. I feel terrible that I didn't have a chance to speak with you properly. You're in finance, Neela tells me. Investments, Taejun said. This was not technically a lie, Nyla thought, though perhaps not the whole picture. And you and Nyla, Lorraine's eyes moved between them with the precision of someone measuring gaps. How exactly did this come about? Because Nyla hasn't mentioned you to any of us. Nyla opened her mouth. Taejun spoke first. She mentioned me to the people who matter to her, he said. His tone was entirely pleasant. It was also entirely final. That group apparently doesn't include everyone. Lorraine's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. Of course, she said. We're just... You understand, as a family, we want to know the people in each other's lives, especially when... She paused with the delicacy of a woman about to deploy something sharp. We've watched Nyla on her own for so long. I see, Taejun said. It can be difficult, Lorraine continued, when someone waits as long as she has. The concern is natural. Taejun was quiet for a moment. Around them, the garden continued its ambient noise, the string quartet, the voices of guests, the sound of champagne being poured. When he spoke, his voice remained exactly as pleasant as it had been. Nyla built a business from a building that belonged to her grandmother, he said. She maintained it through 3 years of difficulty that destroyed most comparable operations in this city. She employs people. She sustains a community institution. She does this while managing her own finances, her own time, and her own life. He paused. I'm curious what you mean by on her own. In my experience, doing things on your own is usually something people are admired for. Lorraine's champagne flute, apparently relocated to her hand, was very still. Of course, she said. Of course. I only meant... I understood what you meant, Taejun said, and smiled. It was a small, clean, entirely unreadable smile. Nyla is extraordinary. I think perhaps that's been difficult to see from nearby. Lorraine looked at Nyla. Nyla looked back. For 30 years, she had wanted someone in her corner in this garden. Not to fight for her. She had never needed anyone to fight. Just to be there. Just to make the weight distribute differently. She breathed. Lorraine said, well, and found somewhere else to be. After she left, Nyla stood very still for a moment. She could hear her own heartbeat. The evening was going amber around them, and the garden smelled like jasmine and something being rearranged. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. The agreement was an hour. It's been 45 minutes, he said. We have 15 left. She looked at him. He looked back, calm, present, carrying whatever he carried in the place behind his eyes that she couldn't reach. Taejun, she started. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, but she'd been watching him closely enough to read the shift. The absolute stillness around his eyes went fractionally tighter, a muscle in his jaw. Nothing else. He looked up. I need to take this, he said. Go ahead. He moved several steps away, and she watched him answer and say something brief and low, and then listen. The listening was the part that stayed with her afterward. in the weeks when she turned this evening over in her hands, trying to understand it. He listened with an attention that was different from the attention he'd given everything else tonight. Focused, alert, the specific quality of a man receiving news he had been waiting for and had already planned around. He came back. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. A real look, she thought. Not the managed calm, but something beneath it, as if for the length of that look he had let something come closer to the surface. "Yes," he said. "There's someone outside. I need to speak with them briefly." "Of course. Stay here," he said. "I'll be back." He moved through the garden toward the gate with that same quality of movement, unhurried, deliberate, commanding space without requiring it. And Nyla watched him go and stood in the amber evening with the string quartet and the fading remnants of her family's judgment and the strange, warm knot in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. Across the garden, she saw Marcus looking at her with an expression that said, "I have questions and I have time." And then she saw something else. Through the garden gate, which stood slightly ajar, she could see the parking lot. She could see the black Mercedes, and she could see another black car, a second one, arriving, and two men stepping out, and the way they moved in Tai-jun's direction was not the way guests moved toward each other at a garden party. It was the way men moved when something required managing. And then one of them said something to Tai-jun, and even from this distance she saw him go very still, a different still from his usual stillness, and she understood without being able to explain how she understood it, that whatever was happening out there in the parking lot was not unrelated to why he'd been standing beside a black Mercedes alone before she'd walked up and asked a stranger to change the shape of her afternoon. He turned and looked back through the gate, found her eyes across the distance. She thought, "Who are you?" He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned back to the men from the second car. And Nyla Brooks stood in her grandmother's garden wearing a dress her mother had criticized twice, with the taste of salmon skewers still on her tongue and $40 still in her bag, and the specific, cold, electric certainty that the last hour had been something she did not yet have the language for. The men from the second car were not valets. Nyla understood this the same way she understood most things that didn't announce themselves. Through the body first, the skin tightening along the back of her arms, the specific quality of stillness that settled over the parking lot the moment the second black sedan pulled through the gate. Two men. Dark suits, nothing like Tai-jun's. His fit like it had been commissioned for him specifically. Theirs fit like armor selected for function. They moved with the clipped efficiency of people who had somewhere to be and something to manage. And the moment they reached Tai-jun, they formed a loose triangle around him that was not threatening, but was absolutely not casual. She was still watching through the garden gate. She should not have been watching. She should have turned back toward the tables and Marcus's questions and the manageable social mathematics of the next 30 minutes. Instead, she stood where she was, with the evening going amber around her, and watched Tai-jun receive whatever news had arrived in that second car, with the same contained stillness he brought to everything. Except not quite the same. Something in the line of his shoulders. Something in the way his chin dropped a fraction and then came back up. He turned and found her eyes again across the distance. She didn't look away. He said something to the two men. One of them nodded. The other glanced briefly toward the garden gate, toward Nyla, and then back at Tai-jun, and whatever passed between them was short and final. Tai-jun walked back through the gate alone. "I'm sorry," he said, arriving beside her. That required attention. "You don't have to explain. I know." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right? I'm the one who dragged a stranger to my family's engagement party. I should be asking you that." "I volunteered," he said, "for $40. The loyalty card was the deciding factor. She stared at him. The corner of his mouth moved. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the parking lot. Not all the way, just enough to breathe differently. "Marcus is watching us," she said. "The one at the table who stopped pretending to drink his wine." "That's the one. He's been watching since we came back from the dance," Tai-jun said. "He's not hostile. He's protective of you." She glanced over. Marcus was indeed watching them with the focused attention of a man performing a security assessment. "He's been my best cousin since we were 8, she said. "He drove me to the emergency room when I broke my wrist at 14 and told my mother I'd fallen off a bike." "Had you?" "I'd been trying to jump a fence on a dare. The distinction matters." She paused. "He's going to want to talk to you." "Then we should let him." They moved back toward the tables. Marcus was ready for them before they arrived, straightening in his chair with the elaborate casualness of a man who had been composing his approach for the last 10 minutes. Taejun, he said. He'd skipped any preamble. Marcus Brooks, I'm Nyla's cousin. He extended his hand across the table and Taejun shook it. How long did you say you two have been together? I didn't, Taejun said. Marcus blinked. Okay, direct. I respect that. He glanced at Nyla. 4 months, right? That's what I heard. About 4 months, Nyla said. Marcus picked up his wine glass, didn't drink from it. And where'd you say you met? Through a mutual connection, Nyla said. Mutual connection, Marcus repeated. Right, and this mutual connection. Marcus. She kept her voice flat. I'm being supportive, he said, with complete sincerity and zero believability. You're interrogating him. I'm making conversation. There's a difference. He looked at Taejun. No offense? None, Taejun said. It's just... Marcus set the wine glass down. He was dropping the casual scaffolding, she realized. He was going to say something real. Nyla hasn't brought anyone to a family thing in 3 years, and the last time she did... He paused, glancing in the direction of the main table where Ethan sat. It didn't go particularly well for her. So... He looked at Taejun directly. I'm asking. The table went quiet. Around them the garden party continued at its ambient volume. Silverware and voices and the string quartet starting something new. But the immediate space around the three of them had a different quality. Nyla felt the familiar pull of embarrassment, that old reflex of wanting to redirect and minimize. She didn't. Taejun said, That's fair. Marcus waited. Nyla is... Taejun paused, and she looked at him, and he was doing that thing where the calculation ran behind his eyes. But this time it was different. This time it had the quality of someone choosing accurate words rather than strategic ones. She's not someone I expected to meet. The way it happened was not something either of us planned. He looked at Nyla briefly, and she understood he was threading the needle between truth and performance with a precision that was almost uncomfortable to watch. I think when you find something unexpected, you pay attention to it. That's what I've done. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. Okay, Nyla said. I still have questions. Marcus pointed a finger at Taejun. But okay. He picked up his wine and drank from it for the first time all evening. Don't make me regret it. I'll do my best, Taejun said. It was around that moment that Ethan Holloway decided the evening required his participation. Nyla saw him coming before he arrived. That particular way he moved through rooms, charting the most visible path, ensuring that his approach was noted. He'd picked up a fresh champagne glass and wore the expression he used when he wanted to appear relaxed, while communicating something else entirely. He was not alone. He brought with him a man Nyla didn't recognize, 50s, silver-haired, with the brick-solid quality of someone whose net worth had become a physical attribute. Nyla, Ethan said, arriving at the edge of the table with the warmth of a man who was working very hard. Didn't know if you were still here. Thought maybe you'd headed out early. He said this as if her leaving early were the expected outcome. As if her being present and seated at the main table with a man who had just danced with her in front of 50 witnesses required an explanation. Still here, she said. His eyes moved to Taejun. They performed the kind of assessment that men like Ethan performed constantly without appearing too rapid, measuring, arriving at conclusions that were then concealed behind pleasantness. Whatever he concluded, the pleasantness went slightly glacier. Ethan Holloway, he said, extending his hand toward Taejun. Priya's fiancé. Kang Taejun. He shook it once. You're a friend of Nyla's. Yes, Taejun said. Ethan waited for more. He didn't get more. Something shifted behind his eyes, not dramatically, but she'd spent 2 years studying that face, and she could read the micro-architecture of his discomfort. He hadn't been handed the script he came over expecting, and he was improvising, which Ethan could do but didn't prefer. This is Gerald Marsh, he said, gesturing to the silver-haired man. He's been working with me on a development project. Gerald, this is Nyla. She runs the bakery on Clement Street I've mentioned. The way he said the bakery on Clement Street I've mentioned communicated, in 8 words, everything Nyla needed to know about the last 3 years of Ethan Holloway's internal narrative. She was a detail. A footnote. something that had been mentioned in the context of a development project. Marcus had gone very still across the table. Gerald Marsh looked at Nyla with the kind of polished attention that wasn't really attention at all. "Right," he said. "The holdout property." The words landed in the space between all of them and sat there. The holdout property. Nyla looked at Ethan. Ethan's jaw shifted very slightly. A tell she remembered, the small movement that meant he had just realized someone had said something he hadn't intended to be said. Gerald Marsh seemed to register it a half-second later, and his expression recalibrated toward neutral, which was too late. "Gerald means," Ethan started. "I know what he means," Nyla said. She did. She had spent 8 months dealing with a development company making increasingly aggressive offers on the bakery. First polite, then persistent, then operating through a lawyer whose letters had begun to carry the quiet promise of what happened when people didn't cooperate. She had refused every offer. She had been told, by that same lawyer's letters, that the neighborhood development was inevitable, and that her position was unsustainable. She had filed the letters and kept baking and told no one in her family because it was her problem and she handled her own problems. She was looking at Ethan. She was watching his face arrange itself. She was understanding something. "How long have you known about the offers?" she said. "Nyla." "How long, Ethan?" The pleasant surface cracked slightly. Not all the way. He was too practiced for that. But enough. "The project has multiple stakeholders. I'm one piece of a large— Are you invested in the company trying to buy my block?" Gerald Marsh had taken a small step back, the instinctive repositioning of a man who wanted to be at a different table. "This is not the place," Ethan started. "Is that a yes?" Marcus said. "Nyla." "I'm not raising my voice," she said. She wasn't. She was sitting very still at the main table of her cousin's engagement party, with her hands flat on the tablecloth and speaking at a normal volume while the string quartet played something in the middle distance, and the specific control of this, the absolute refusal to give him the spectacle of her losing it, was the hardest thing she'd done all day. "I'm asking a direct question," Ethan said. "We can talk about this another time." "That's a yes," she said. He said nothing. She looked at Taijun. He was watching Ethan, the same way he'd watched everything else, completely, without urgency. But she saw something in the quality of his attention that she couldn't categorize. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. The particular stillness of someone receiving information they already possessed. She had the dislocating sensation, briefly, of being the only person at this table who didn't know the whole story. Ethan left. Gerald Marsh followed without needing to be asked. They moved back toward the main tables with the managed casualness of a retreat that was refusing to call itself a retreat. Marcus leaned across the table. "What just happened?" "I don't entirely know," Nyla said. She looked at Taijun again. He had turned back toward her and his expression was, as always, composed. But there was something in the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes, something in the angle of his jaw that had the specific texture of a man with information he was deciding how to handle. "Taijun," she said. "Yes." "Do you know something about Ethan Holloway?" It was not a question. She had phrased it as a statement, and she watched him receive it. He was quiet for a moment. 3 seconds. 4. The string quartet continued. Somewhere across the garden, Priya was laughing at something her new fiancé had said. "Not here," Taijun said. Her stomach dropped. "That's a yes." "That is me saying not here." He looked at her steadily. "Later. I'll tell you what I can." "What you can," she said, "as opposed to what you know." He didn't answer that. Marcus looked between them with the expression of a man watching a foreign film without subtitles. Nyla sat back in her chair. The evening had shifted again. Not in temperature or light, but in some quality she was having trouble naming. She felt the outline of something large moving beneath the surface of the last 2 hours. The too convenient parking lot. The agreed-upon lie. The men from the second car. Ethan's visible recalibration at the mere fact of Taijun's existence. Gerald Marsh and his holdout property, and the way he'd stepped back when the air changed. He had originally come that afternoon intending to meet the fearless bakery owner. The thought arrived unbidden, and she pushed it away because it was insane. And she was not the kind of person who arrived at insane conclusions without evidence. And she did not have evidence. She had a stranger in a perfectly fitted suit who had agreed to pose as her boyfriend for $40, and had instead dismantled her aunt's social architecture and danced with her in the amber evening and said things about her that she had not known she needed someone to say. She picked up her water glass and drank from it. Across the garden, she saw Lorraine approaching Priya and saying something that made Priya look toward Nyla's table with an expression she couldn't read at this distance. Then she saw Ethan on his phone. He had moved away from the main tables to the garden's eastern edge, near the rose arbor, and he was on his phone with the quality of a man receiving information he did not want to receive. She could not hear him. She did not need to. The posture was language she could read, the forward lean, the free hand coming up to press flat against his chest, the slight bowing of his head that meant the news arriving through the phone required physical management. Something was happening. "Excuse me," Taijun said. He stood up. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To get you more water." He picked up her glass, which was half full, and she understood immediately that he was not going to get her more water. He was going somewhere else. He was doing it with the glass as a reason because he was giving her plausible deniability, or giving himself room to move, or both. She let him go. She watched him cross the garden, not toward the water station, but in a long, angled path that took him near the rose arbor without appearing to, the way water finds its way around things, without appearing to choose a direction. He passed within 15 feet of where Ethan stood on his phone, still bent over that incoming disaster, and he paused near a group of guests with his glass in hand and his eyes somewhere else. Marcus said very quietly, "Nyla." "I know." "No. I mean, Nyla." He leaned in. "3 of Gerald Marsh's people have been on their phones in the last 5 minutes. I've been watching." She looked at him. "Something is happening," Marcus said. "Something that isn't this party." She looked toward Ethan. His free hand had moved from his chest to his hair, his fingers pressing against his skull. The champagne glass was now on the ground at his feet. He had put it down without looking. Priya appeared at the edge of the main table, looking across the garden toward Ethan with a frown she was trying not to display. Lorraine materialized beside her with the efficiency of a woman who treated family crises as logistical problems. They murmured to each other. Lorraine's champagne flute was very still. Taejun came back with the glass of water. He set it in front of Nyla and sat down and met her eyes. She searched his face. "Tell me something true," she said. Low, for him only. His jaw moved. She watched him choose. "You weren't going to lose the bakery," he said. The garden noise continued around them. The evening continued its amber tipping toward blue. Nyla sat with those 7 words in the space between them and felt the ground rearrange itself beneath her. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means what it says." "Taejun, not here." His voice was quiet and absolutely firm. "An hour. Give me an hour and I'll tell you everything. Tell me something now." He looked at her for a long moment. In that look she saw for the first time something she hadn't seen before. Not the managed calm, not the deliberate stillness. Something rawer than that. A man calculating the cost of honesty against the cost of delay and finding both prices steep. "The company that's been pressuring you to sell," he said. "It has a problem." "What kind of problem?" "A financial one." He paused. "A permanent one." She stared at him. "Since this morning," he said, she did not speak. She was very good at not speaking when not speaking was what the moment required, and this moment required it absolutely. Across the garden, Ethan Holloway had stopped his phone call. He was standing very still near the rose arbor with his phone at his side and an expression on his face that she had never seen on him before. Not in 2 years of relationship, not in the 3 years since. Ethan had always carried the baseline confidence of a man who had arranged things to go his way, and the expression she was looking at now was what happened when the arrangement stopped working. Gerald Marsh appeared at his side, said something. Ethan looked at him. Then Ethan looked across the garden, not toward Priya, not toward the main tables, toward Taejun. And what was on his face in that moment was not the social calculation she'd watched him perform all evening. It was something older and more honest and considerably colder. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had just understood that he'd been in a room with someone for the last 2 hours without knowing who he was in a room with. Taejun looked back. Nothing moved in his face. Nothing at all. Nyla felt it then. The thing she'd been orbiting all evening, the shape beneath the surface. It arrived not as a revelation, but as a settling, the way a bone that's been slightly out of alignment finally finds its socket. She said, "You didn't come to this party by accident." He said nothing. "You were already here," she said, "parked in that lot, waiting." "Nyla, not for me." She felt the words assembling themselves with a clarity that should have frightened her but didn't. "You didn't come here for me. You didn't know I existed." She looked at his face, that composed, careful face that had spent the last 2 hours doing things she did not fully understand for reasons she had not been told. "You came here for something else, and I walked up and asked you to pretend to be my boyfriend, and you said yes because—" She stopped, breathed. Why? The garden continued around them. The string quartet, the voices, Priya's laugh from somewhere near the center tables. Taejun looked at Nyla with the most unguarded expression she'd seen from him yet, and it was not the expression of a man with a clean answer. It was the expression of a man standing at a line he had not expected to reach so quickly. "Because," he said, "you asked honestly. You said that already. It's still true. That's not all of it." He was quiet. One beat, two. "No," he said, "it's not all of it." And then Priya screamed. Not a social exclamation, a real sound, the involuntary kind that bodies produce before the mind can manage them. It came from the main table, and it was not long, but it cut through every ambient layer of the party and silenced the string quartet mid-phrase and turned every head in the garden simultaneously. Priya was standing at the main table with her phone in her hand and her face doing something Nyla had never seen it do. Not the practiced beauty competition composure, not the gracious hostess warmth, but something stripped and raw that had no performance left in it. Lorraine was at her elbow instantly, reaching for the phone, and Priya let her take it. Across the garden, Ethan Holloway was not moving toward his fiancée. He was looking at his own phone, and then at Gerald Marsh, and then at his phone again. And his face was the face of a man watching a building fall. Marcus said under his breath, "Oh." Nyla looked at Taejun. He was already looking at her. "Tell me," she said. "Right now. Tell me what you know." He looked at her for a moment that had the weight of a decision being made in real time. Not recalculated, not managed, but made. The way decisions got made when the window for preparation had already closed. "My name is Kang Taejun," he said. "You know that part." "I know that part. What you don't know," he said, "is the rest." And the evening, which had already rearranged itself 3 times in the last 2 hours, began its final. "What you don't know," he said, "is the rest." She waited. The garden was reorganizing itself around the sound Priya had made, that involuntary, stripped-down sound that had no performance in it. And people were moving toward the main table with the specific gravity of a crowd sensing real distress beneath social occasion. Lorraine was managing it, or trying to. She had Priya by the arm and was steering her toward the estate's side entrance with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades ensuring that family crises happened off stage. Gerald Marsh had disappeared entirely. 2 of his people were near the garden gate, phones up, moving quickly. Ethan had not moved. He was still standing near the rose arbor with his phone at his side and his face doing something Nyla had no name for. Not anger, not fear. Something older and more animal. The specific stillness of a man in the first seconds of understanding that the structure he'd built his life on had just become weight. Taejun was looking at her. "There's a company," he said, "Pacific Meridian Development. It operates through 7 shell corporations. 3 of them were incorporated in Delaware in the last 18 months. The others are older, cleaner on paper. They've been acquiring property in your neighborhood using a combination of predatory lease restructuring, manufactured code violations, and in 2 cases, direct intimidation of tenants." She sat very still. "They targeted your block 8 months ago," he continued. His voice had not changed in volume or texture. It had the quality of someone delivering a briefing, precise, sequential, without decoration. "Your bakery was the anchor property, the one that, if it sold, would give them the legal mechanism to trigger purchase agreements on 6 adjacent buildings. The other owners had already signed conditional contracts. They were waiting for you." "How do you know this?" she said. "Because I've been watching Pacific Meridian for 14 months. The string quartet had stopped. The ambient noise of the party had reduced itself to murmur and movement as people redistributed around the developing situation near the main tables. Nobody was watching Nyla and Taejun. For the first time all evening, they were completely unobserved. Why? She said. Because they operate in markets where my organization has interests, and because the way they operate, he paused, just briefly, the first real pause she'd heard from him, is not something I'm willing to share territory with. My organization. She heard it. She filed it. She did not ask about it yet because there were more immediate things, and she was still moving through them in order. Ethan, she said. Taejun looked at her. Ethan is involved, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd had 20 minutes to watch the shape of this evening assemble itself, and the shape now included Ethan Holloway standing in the rose arbor with his world collapsing through a phone screen, and it included Gerald Marsh saying holdout property before he could catch himself, and it included 2 years of a relationship with a man who had asked her, very specifically and very early, about the bakery's ownership structure and whether her grandmother had left a clear title. She had told him. She had been 22 and in love, and had told him everything he asked. He's a primary investor, Taejun said, not the architect of the project. That's a man named Kerry Whitfield, based in Atlanta. But Ethan brought in capital, access to the Brooks family investment network, and he stopped. And what? And information, Taejun said, about you specifically, about the bakery's ownership history, the title structure, the building's assessed vulnerabilities, information that would have been difficult to obtain without a personal connection. The garden was still moving around them. Someone near the main table was crying. She couldn't see who. The Edison bulbs in the canopy above were swaying slightly in an evening breeze she hadn't noticed before. Nyla picked up her water glass. She set it back down. He used what I told him, she said. Yes. When we were together. The timeline suggests the project began approximately 4 months after your relationship ended. 4 months. He had spent the last 2 months of their relationship collecting what he needed, and then he had ended things, and waited 4 months, and then built a development project on the foundation of what she'd given him. He had sat across from her at her grandmother's bakery table and eaten the bread she baked and asked her questions about the building and the lease and the title, and she had answered every one of them because she was in love with him, and in love you answered questions. She breathed in, slow, out. You said this morning, she said. You told me something was dealt with this morning. At 9 a.m., Taejun said. Pacific Meridian's operating accounts were frozen by 2 federal banking compliance investigations that were filed simultaneously in Delaware and Georgia. The investment vehicles Ethan used to fund his participation were flagged under a separate securities review. The conditional purchase agreements on the adjacent buildings are void pending investigation. The entire project, he paused, is over. She looked at him. You did that, she said. He said nothing. You did that this morning, she said. And then you came here and parked outside this party, and you were waiting. She stopped, breathed. You were waiting to meet me. Yes, he said. The word sat between them with the weight of everything it carried. Why? She said. Why not just handle the company, deal with Ethan? Why did you need to meet me? He was quiet for a moment that had something real in it. Not managed, not calculated. The specific silence of a man arriving at words he hadn't entirely assembled yet. Because, he said, the woman who refused to sell, for 8 months, through legal pressure and intimidation and increasingly aggressive offers, I wanted to understand who she was. She stared at him. You were described in Pacific Meridian's internal communications as irrational, he said. Intractable. A problem without a reasonable solution. Every rational actor in their model had accepted their terms. You were the only variable they could not account for. I just didn't want to sell, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. That's what I wanted to understand. She looked at this man, this stranger, this not stranger, this person who had spent 8 months dismantling the machinery that was trying to take her grandmother's building, while she spent those same 8 months filing lawyers' letters and ordering butter from a farm 2 hours north, and making sure her 3 employees got paid. And she felt something move through her that was not any single emotion, but all of them compressed together, moving too fast to separate. She pushed her chair back and stood up. I need a minute, she said. She walked toward the estate's main building, the nearest door, moving at the pace of someone who was not running, but needed to not be where she was. She found a hallway inside, carpeted, dim, smelling of old wood and fresh-cut flowers from arrangements on a console table. She found a wall and put her back against it, and stood there. 2 years with Ethan Holloway. 2 years of a man who had sat at her grandmother's table and eaten her bread and asked the right questions and looked at her like she was someone he had chosen, specifically and deliberately, from among everyone available. And she had believed this because she was not stupid, but she was 22 and she wanted to believe it, and the wanting had been enough to fill in the gaps. She should have left unfilled. 4 months after he ended it, he had started building the machine that would take her building. She pressed the back of her head against the wall. She had spent 6 years wondering what was wrong with her. Not constantly, not with wallowing. She was not a wallower, but in the specific, quiet way that questions you can't answer settle into the background of daily life and become ambient. What was wrong with her that she hadn't been enough? What was wrong with her that she kept arriving at family events alone while everyone else built lives that the family could recognize? Ethan Holloway had not left her because she wasn't enough. He had left her because he had what he needed. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere in the garden behind her, the crisis at the main table was still unfolding. She could hear muffled voices, a door opening and closing somewhere in the estate. She stood against the wall and breathed and felt the specific cold fury of understanding that settled in once the shock layer burned off. It was not hot anger. She was past that, or not yet at it, or somewhere adjacent. It was the colder thing, the thing that didn't shout. She heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up. Ethan. He had come through a different door and he was alone, and he had the phone in his hand but not to his ear anymore. And when he saw her, his stride broke slightly before recovering. He stopped 12 feet away. They looked at each other. "I know about Pacific Meridian," she said. His jaw tightened. "I know about the conditional agreements," she said. "I know about the shell corporations. I know you used information I gave you." She kept her voice level. She had practice. "I just want you to know that I know." Ethan said, "It's complicated." "Is it?" "Nyla, this was business. The project was, don't." The word came out sharp enough that he stopped. "Don't explain the project to me. I don't need the explanation. I need you to know that I know. That's all." He ran a hand through his hair. It was the same gesture she'd watched him make in the rose arbor, and it had the quality of a habit, something the body did when the mind was processing faster than it could manage. "Things have gone wrong tonight," he said. "There are financial complications that I didn't—" He stopped, reassembled. "I need to talk to Priya." "Yes," Nyla said. "You do. This thing with you and—" He gestured vaguely toward the garden, toward the general location of Tae-Jun, whoever he is. "I need to understand who he is." "Why?" "Because he's not in finance," Ethan said. "I know people in finance. That man is not—" He stopped again. She watched the computation run. "Gerald recognized him. Gerald wouldn't tell me from what." "I think," Nyla said, "that's a conversation you should have with Gerald." Ethan looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't all evening. Not the social performing of looking, but the actual thing, and in it she saw, briefly, the 23-year-old she had first met at a mutual friend's dinner, before she knew what he was, before she understood the specific mechanics of how he moved through the world. For a single second, he just looked like a man standing in a hallway, understanding that he had broken something that could not be unbroken. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "I am," he said. "For the thing with the information. For not—" He stopped. He did not finish it. She understood that he had arrived at sorry and could not get past it into anything more specific because specificity would require him to say out loud what he had done, and Ethan Holloway had always preferred the feeling of accountability to its content. "Okay," she said. "Okay? You're sorry. I heard you." She pushed off from the wall. "I need to go back out there. Nyla." She walked past him. She went back through the door into the evening garden, and she felt the air change against her face, warmer outside, smelling of jasmine and the first beginning of night, and she stood on the threshold for a moment orienting herself. Tae-Jun was where she'd left him, standing beside the table, glass of water in hand, watching the garden with the composed attention of a man who was comfortable in his own stillness. He saw her come through the door, and he looked at her with the question he did not ask out loud. She walked back to him. "I need you to tell me the rest," she said. "All of it." "Here?" "Wherever, but now." He nodded. He set down the glass. They moved away from the main tables toward the garden's northern edge, where the boxwoods made a kind of natural screen and the lanterns were fewer, and the noise of the party's ongoing reorganization was muffled. He stopped when they had enough privacy. My organization, he said, operates across 23 cities on the East Coast. Legitimate businesses, property management, logistics, hospitality, financial services. Built over 15 years. He looked at her steadily. We also operate in the spaces where legitimate institutions fail to reach. Enforcement, resolution, the management of situations that require capabilities those institutions don't employ. She held his gaze. You're telling me you're organized crime. I'm telling you what I am, he said. Yes, she breathed. The properties I hold in your neighborhood, he continued. I began acquiring them 11 months ago, not to develop them, not to flip them. I have property managers in each building with instructions to maintain existing tenants and existing rents. The intention was to create a wall Pacific Meridian could not purchase through. To protect the block, she said. To protect the bakery, he said. The block followed from that. Why the bakery specifically? He looked at her. That, he said, is the part I was going to tell you tonight. That I came here to tell you. He paused. It's not a short answer. Then give me the short version and the long version later. 22 years ago, he said, I came to this country with nothing. 17 years old, no family here, no money. I spoke minimal English and I had the specific anger of someone who had been given a very bad hand and told to be grateful for it. He stopped. His jaw moved. She watched him find the next words. There was a bakery on Clement Street. An old woman who opened at 5 a.m. and kept a stool beside the front counter. Every morning for 4 months she gave me bread and coffee without asking me anything. Not who I was. Not where I was from. Not whether I could pay. She just... He stopped again. The pause this time was different from all the others. Deeper, something surfacing. She just fed me. Nyla was very still. Her name, he said, was May Brooks. The name hit her like cold water. She heard it and she felt it, and the garden went slightly distant around her as if the audio had been adjusted, the ambient sounds of the party pulling back to make room for what was happening in the immediate space between them. Her grandmother, May Brooks, who had opened the bakery in 1987 and run it for 31 years until the arthritis made the early mornings impossible. May Brooks, who had kept a stool beside the front counter and never asked anyone their business. May Brooks, who had told Nyla once, when Nyla was 12, that feeding someone was the most honest thing you could offer because it asked nothing and it could not be faked. Nyla's eyes were dry. She did not cry easily, and this was not the moment for it. Not because the moment didn't deserve it, but because she needed to be present in it, fully, without anything blurring the edges. The bread I make, she said. The recipes are hers. I know, he said. The sourdough, the sesame rolls, the honey pastry she made on Saturdays. Something moved in his face that she had not seen there before. Something that had been behind the composed surface for the entire evening and had now come through. I recognized the smell the first time I walked past your bakery 3 years ago. You can know something intellectually. You can tell yourself that an old woman has probably passed by now, that the world has continued, and still have your body respond before your mind can manage it. She looked at him. This man, who controlled 23 cities, who froze investment accounts at 9 in the morning, who moved through garden parties like weather, who had agreed to $40 and a loyalty card with the specific dignity of someone who did not need the $40 but understood what was being asked, had spent 3 years walking past the building his grandmother equivalent had fed him in because the smell of the bread was the kind of thing that got into the body and stayed. You protected it, she said. For 3 years I had it watched, he said. When Pacific Meridian appeared, I began acquiring the perimeter. When their pressure on you escalated, I accelerated the timeline. He paused. This morning I ended it. You ended it, she said, and then you came to a party where Ethan Holloway would be in attendance. Yes. Were you going to confront him? I was going to make sure he understood, Taejun said, that he was finished in this city. She absorbed this. And then I walked up to you. And then you walked up to me, he confirmed, with $40. And the loyalty card. Something happened to her face. She wasn't sure what. She felt it more than she could describe it. A shift somewhere between the eyes and the mouth that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, and was neither of those things but contained both. She pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth and breathed. "Taejun?" she said. "Yes." "This is an insane situation." "Yes," he agreed. "I need—" She started, and then stopped because from across the garden came a sound that reorganized everything again. Not a scream this time. Voices. Raised ones, the specific pitch of a confrontation that had moved past pretense into something real. She turned toward the main tables. Priya was standing. Ethan had come back through the garden. She'd seen him pass through the door behind her without registering it, and he was at the main table now, and Priya was standing with her phone in her hand, screened toward him, and her face was not crying anymore. Her face was the face of a woman who had cried and was done. Lorraine was very still at the edge of the scene. The guests who had not already drifted toward this were drifting toward it now, with the irresistible gravity of a crowd scenting something real. Priya said, loudly enough to carry, "How long have you known the money was gone?" Ethan said something low. "How long?" Priya said. Nyla looked at Taejun. He was already watching the scene with an expression that was not satisfaction. She checked for that, she looked for it carefully, and didn't find it. What she found was the specific calm of a man watching an outcome he had anticipated arrive at its designated time. "The accounts were frozen this morning," she said. "Ethan didn't know yet when he arrived here." "No. He found out tonight, at the party." "Yes. At his engagement party," she said. "In front of everyone." Taejun said nothing. She understood then the specific precision of the timing. Not cruelty for its own sake. She didn't think he operated on cruelty. She thought he operated on outcomes. But the deliberate decision to let Ethan Holloway stand in a garden full of the people whose opinion he'd spent years managing, at the moment his fiancée's family understood that the fortune he'd represented was a fabrication, with no private space to contain the damage. She should have felt something ambivalent about that. She searched herself for ambivalence. She did not find it. Across the garden, Priya's mother had appeared at Lorraine's side, and the two older women stood together watching the scene at the main table with the specific expressions of women who had permitted something they were now being asked to account for. Derek Whitmore, Priya's fiancé, the actual good one, the one who had sat at the center table all evening with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had not expected the event to develop this texture, had stood up and was saying something to Priya with his hand on her arm, and she was letting him, which meant something. Ethan was alone at the table. His phone was in his hand, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man checking the same thing repeatedly and getting the same answer, the specific disbelief of someone whose fail-safes have failed. Lorraine moved. She crossed the garden with the deliberate energy of a woman who had decided that the situation required management and that she was the one to provide it. And she stopped in front of Ethan and said something very quiet and very direct that Nyla could not hear from this distance. Whatever it was, Ethan looked up from his phone. He looked at Lorraine, then he looked across the garden. He found Taejun. The look that moved between them across the crowded garden was brief and absolute. No performance, no social coding. The specific look of a man who had finally identified the origin point of his catastrophe and was standing too far away and too late to do anything about it. Taejun held the look without expression. Ethan looked away first. Lorraine said something else. Ethan nodded once, mechanically, and pocketed his phone and began moving toward the garden's exit with the compressed, minimal movement of a man trying to occupy as little space as possible while doing so. He did not stop at the main table. He did not speak to Priya again. He went through the gate to the parking lot, and the garden registered his departure in a ripple of murmur and repositioning, and then he was gone. The engagement party continued without its groom. Nyla stood at the northern edge of the garden with Taejun beside her, and watched the aftermath organize itself, and felt the evening settle into a new shape around the absence Ethan had left. "He's going to come after you," she said. "Not tonight, but eventually, when he figures out the full picture." "Yes," Taejun said. "Is that a problem?" He looked at her with something that might have been, in a different man, amusement. "No," he said. She nodded. She was processing too many things in parallel. Her grandmother's name in his mouth, the specific architecture of what Ethan had done with 2 years of her trust, the $40 still in her bag, the loyalty card, the dance in the amber evening that had been performance and then had not been, and under all of it, the particular thing that happened when someone told you the truth you hadn't known you were waiting for. Her phone vibrated. She pulled it out. A text from Marcus. Where are you? Also, your aunt is looking for you. Also, everything is on fire. Also, I think your boyfriend might be the most terrifying person I have ever met, and I mean that as a compliment. Please advise." She looked up from the phone. Taejun was watching her. "Lorraine is looking for me," she said. "I imagine she is. She's going to want to—" Nyla stopped. "She's going to want to pretend she was always on my side." "Yes, and I'm going to have to decide how to handle that." "Yes," he said. "You are." She put the phone back in her bag. She looked at the garden, at the people redistributing around the new reality, at Priya standing with Derek's hand still on her arm, at Lorraine moving toward Nyla with the specific energy of a woman in full tactical redirect. And she felt something she hadn't felt when she walked through this gate 4 hours ago. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter than either. The specific feeling of standing on ground that was hers. Lorraine arrived. She arrived with the champagne flute gone and her hands at her sides and an expression on her face that had shed the social lacquer entirely. What was underneath was not warmth. It was not that simple. But it was real in a way the previous version hadn't been. "Nyla," she said. Nyla waited. "I owe you an apology," Lorraine said. She said it the way people said things they had practiced enough to say, but not enough to say easily. "The table. Tonight. That was—" She stopped. "That was unkind." Nyla looked at her aunt, at the woman who had spent 6 years finding increasingly precise ways to communicate that Nyla's life did not measure up to a standard Lorraine had set without anyone's consent. She looked at her and understood, clearly, that this apology was real, and also that it had been produced by the evening's events, rather than by any internal reckoning that had preceded them. She thought of what Taejun had said in the garden, when Lorraine had first approached them. Respect shown only after discovering someone's power is not respect at all. She had not heard him say it yet. That was still coming. She didn't know that yet, standing here. But she would think about it later, and she would understand it applied here, to this moment, to this apology that had been made possible by the presence of a man in a perfectly fitted suit who had reorganized the room's understanding of who Nyla Brooks was. She was not going to accept an apology that had been produced by external pressure and call it a changed heart. But she was also not going to perform bitterness she didn't fully feel. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." Lorraine nodded. Her eyes moved to Taejun with something in them that was no longer assessment or recalibration, but something more honest than either. Something close to uncertainty, which Lorraine Pemberton Brooks wore like a garment she had not owned before and didn't know quite how to carry. Taejun looked at her and said, calmly and without any particular inflection, "Mrs. Pemberton Brooks, I want to be direct with you about something." Lorraine waited. "When you placed Nyla at the children's table tonight," he said, "you made a decision about her value based on what she had not yet done, not on what she had built, not on who she is." He paused. "I understand why you might be reconsidering that decision now, given what this evening became. But I want you to understand, the reconsideration should have nothing to do with me." The garden was very quiet around the three of them. "Nyla has always been worth reconsidering," he said. "Tonight didn't create that. Tonight just made it harder to ignore." He looked at her steadily. "From this point, I'd suggest the consideration be ongoing, regardless of who is or isn't standing beside her." Lorraine was silent for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You're right." And something in her face, underneath the silver hair and the 30 years of performed authority, showed the first honest thing Nyla had ever seen it show. The specific expression of a person encountering a version of themselves they do not entirely. Lorraine's face held that expression, the one with no name for it, the honest one, for approximately 4 seconds before she recovered enough to nod once and excuse herself back into the garden with the careful dignity of a woman reassembling herself in real time. Nyla watched her go. The Edison bulbs overhead had gone fully warm now, yellow against the darkening blue of the evening sky, and the garden had rearranged itself into something quieter and stranger than it had started as. Priya was inside the estate with Derek and her mother. The string quartet had packed up. The catering staff was moving through the remaining guests with quiet efficiency, collecting glasses, asking no questions. The party was not over, but it was ending. The way things ended when the central reason for gathering had been removed. Marcus appeared from behind a hydrangea bush with 2 glasses of water and the expression of a man who had been doing surveillance. I heard most of that, he said, handing Nyla a glass. I know, she said. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was standing nearby for support. Marcus, I was absolutely eavesdropping. He looked at Taejun. You just said that to my aunt, to Lorraine Pemberton Brooks, who has made every family gathering for 30 years operate according to her specific personal gravity. He paused. Nobody has ever said anything like that to her. Someone should have, Taejun said. Marcus considered this. Yeah, he said. Yeah, they really should have. He drank from his water. Okay. I have one question, and then I'll stop asking questions. Nyla said, You will absolutely not stop asking questions. I'll stop asking questions tonight, Taejun. He turned. What do you actually do? Taejun looked at him steadily. I manage significant assets across multiple industries and ensure that the operating environments for those assets remain stable. Marcus processed this. That's the most expensive way I've ever heard someone say I handle problems. Yes, Taejun said. Okay, Marcus said. He looked at Nyla. I'm supportive, he said. I remain aggressively supportive. He kissed her on the top of her head, a thing he'd done since they were children, and he was 3 inches shorter than her before the growth spurt, a habit that had persisted after he was 4 inches taller, and walked back toward the remaining guests. Neela stood with her water glass in the fading garden. We should go, Taejun said. Probably. You've done what you came to do. She thought about table 4 with its yellow tablecloth and its balloon centerpieces, and the children who had dismantled their bread rolls with the focused energy of people with no awareness of the surrounding social architecture. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about $40 and a loyalty card with 6 punches on it. She thought about the way the string quartet had played something with a minor key when they danced, and the smell of jasmine, and the specific sentence her grandmother had spoken once about bread, and how Taejun had received that sentence with his whole body without knowing that was what he was doing. Yes, she said. I have. They left through the garden gate together. The parking lot was quiet. Most guests had begun dispersing after the engagement's public implosion, and the valets had been busy for the past 20 minutes running cars around. Nyla's Honda sat where she'd left it, dashboard crack invisible in the dark, reliable in the particular way of things that were not glamorous but never failed when you needed them. They stopped beside it. The lot was nearly empty. 2 valets at the far end talking, a black sedan at the estate's main entrance, waiting for someone. The second car, the one that had arrived with Taejun's men, was gone. The men who came, she said. Earlier. What was that? Information, he said, about the account freezes, confirming everything had processed correctly. Was it necessary for them to come in person? No, he said, but I'd asked to be informed directly when it was confirmed. She looked at him. Because you wanted to know it was done before you talked to me. Yes. She absorbed that. You were going to tell me tonight regardless, before I asked. I came here to tell you, he said. The rest of it, the party, your family, the hour of whatever this was, a pause, I had not planned for. Neither had I, she said. The parking lot was very still. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, the last guests were murmuring through departures. A car started somewhere, and its headlights swept briefly across the lot and then swung away. Dinner, she said. He looked at her. You told me at the beginning. You said if this was going to be real, it should start honestly. I'm starting it honestly. She felt the words cost something, the specific cost of saying a true thing out loud when you hadn't confirmed it was safe to. I want to have dinner with you. As myself, not as a performance. He said, yes, simple, direct. The same way he'd said, all right in the parking lot 4 hours ago with her loyalty card in his hand. Okay, she said. She got in her car. He stood beside his until she pulled out, and she watched him in the rearview mirror as she turned toward the lot's exit, standing with his hands at his sides, the black Mercedes behind him, the estate's lights going amber above the hedgerow. And she thought, this is the most impossible day I have ever had, and I don't regret a single minute of it. She drove home. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She was a 5 a.m. baker, and her sleep schedule had its own eccentric logic, regardless of events. But the quality of the wakefulness was different from its usual texture. She lay in the dark of her apartment above the bakery with the ambient sounds of Clement Street filtering up through the floor and turned the evening over and over in her hands. Her grandmother had fed a frightened 17-year-old bread and coffee for 4 months without asking who he was. That 17-year-old had grown into a man who froze financial accounts across 2 states and walked into a garden party in a perfectly fitted suit and dismantled a decade of her family's social architecture by being completely, unnervingly himself. And the bread that had kept him alive was the same bread she made every morning. She pressed her forearm over her eyes and lay very still. Sometime around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went down to the bakery and started the first proof. The dough had its own demand, and she gave herself to it. The weight of it, the temperature, the specific resistance under her palms that told her what the fermentation was doing. This was what she knew. This was the most honest thing she had learned how to do. At 5:15, when she opened the front door and turned on the lights, and the smell of the first loaves filled the street-level air, she let herself think about what came next. What came next arrived 3 days later in the form of a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was not Tai-jun. It was a man she didn't know, speaking with the specific pleasantness of someone whose pleasantness was a professional instrument. He identified himself as a representative of Carrie Whitfield, the name Ta-jun had given her, the Atlanta architect of Pacific Meridian, and said that Mr. Whitfield wanted to arrange a conversation with Ms. Brooks at her earliest convenience. She said, "About what?" The man said, "A resolution." She said, "I'll think about it," and hung up and called Tae-jun. He picked up on the second ring. She told him. There was a pause on his end that had a quality she was starting to be able to read. Not surprise, but recalculation. "Don't agree to anything," he said. "I wasn't planning to. Don't meet with anyone from Whitfield's organization without telling me first." "I understand. Nyla." A pause. "I'm going to come by the bakery this afternoon." "Okay." He came at 3, between the lunch rush and the evening, when the bakery was in its quiet hour and the display cases were half emptied, and the light came through the front window at the angle she'd spent 30 years watching it move. He sat at the counter, the same stool, and she set a coffee in front of him and a sesame roll and stood on the other side. He looked at the roll for a moment. "This is the one," he said. "Yes." He picked it up. She watched him hold it the way you held something that had a specific weight that wasn't just the thing itself, and she turned around and pretended to check something in the pass-through so he could have the moment without being observed. When she turned back, he was drinking his coffee, and his face was composed. "Whitfield is making a move," he said. "The account freezes slowed him, but he's not stopped. He has enough structural separation from Pacific Meridian that the compliance investigations don't touch his personal assets directly." He set the coffee down. "He's going to try to approach you independently, without Ethan's involvement. He'll offer something that looks like a clean deal, above market, no contingencies, and he'll have a lawyer standing by." "To do what?" "To explain why it would be in your interest to accept quickly." She looked at him. "Is it?" "No," he said. "The building is worth more than he'll offer, not in money, in what removing it from the block would enable him to do to the adjacent properties. He needs this building as a linchpin, and he knows it." "Then what do I do?" "Nothing," he said. "You do nothing. You bake your bread, and you serve your customers, and you do not respond to Carrie Whitfield's people." He looked at her steadily. "I'll handle Whitfield." "How?" "The same way I handle everything," he said, "by making sure that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping." She studied him. "How high are you willing to push that cost?" He held her gaze. "High enough." She understood what that meant and didn't understand the full specifics, and understood, in a way that was new and required some adjustment, that she was okay with that. This was the part of loving someone, and she had not yet said that word even inside her own head, but it was beginning to be there, working its way toward the surface. That required you to accept the places where their world operated differently from yours, without making them wrong for it. She went back to work. 6 days later, Carrie Whitfield flew in from Atlanta. She knew this because Tae-jun told her at 7 in the morning by text. "Whitfield is in the city. Don't open the back door for anyone today. I mean that literally." She texted back, "Why the back door specifically?" He texted, "Because the front door has a camera and people who intend trouble prefer not to be recorded." She stood in the bakery at 7:15 reading that text and felt the temperature of the situation change in a way it hadn't in the previous week. The financial disruption, the engagement implosion, the Ethan revelation, those had been corporate and social, cold damage, clean damage, the kind that happened through screens and account numbers. This was different. This was Whitfield in the city and the back door and a text that had the specific texture of someone who was no longer managing a situation from a distance. She locked the back door. She texted her 3 employees to use the front entrance only today, no explanation needed. She served her customers and kept the display cases filled and watched the front window between orders. At 11:40, a man came in who was not a regular customer. She knew immediately. You develop the instinct after enough years of early mornings, the way a person held themselves when they were in a room for a purpose other than the room's stated purpose. This man was 50s, wide, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more pragmatic with time. He wore a jacket that was slightly too warm for the weather. He looked at the pastries in the case with the eyes of someone who was not looking at the pastries. He said, "Ms. Brooks." She said, "Can I help you?" He put a business card on the counter, not Whitfield's card, a law firm's card. Charleston address. "Mr. Whitfield would like to meet with you today. He's in the city for a limited time, and he believes the 2 of you could reach an arrangement that would be beneficial to—" "I'm working," she said. "Ms. Brooks." "I'm working," she said again, and moved to help the next customer in line with the complete finality of a woman who had not shifted position and was not going to. The man stood at the counter for a moment. He picked up the business card. He looked at her with something in his face that was not aggressive but was also not neutral. The specific look of someone communicating that this was a courtesy that would not be extended indefinitely. He left. She called Tae-jun. "He sent a lawyer. I know. There's someone outside who saw him come in. You have someone watching the bakery. Since this morning." She absorbed that. Tae-jun. "Yes. How close is this to becoming a problem I can't manage?" A pause. 3 seconds. "I'm handling Whitfield today," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to meet with him this afternoon, and we're going to reach a mutual understanding." "And if you don't?" "We will." She held the phone against her ear and looked at the bakery, the display cases, the flour-dusted prep table visible through the pass-through, the crack in the counter tile she kept meaning to have repaired, the photo above the espresso machine of her grandmother standing outside the front door in 1989, young and solid and slightly squinting into the sun. She looked at all of it and felt the specific weight of loving something you couldn't fully protect. "Tell me where," she said. "Nyla, tell me where you're meeting him." I'm not asking to be protected," she said. "I'm asking to be present. This is my building, my grandmother's building. Whatever you're going to say to him, I want to be in the room." A longer pause this time. "The Harrington," he said finally. "4th floor, 3 o'clock." She closed the bakery at 2:15, left her assistant manager in charge of the remaining prep, and drove to the Harrington Hotel in a 7-year-old Honda with a cracked dashboard mount. She parked in the garage and rode the elevator up with her hands in the pockets of the same green wrap dress because she had not had time to go home and change, and also because she was done apologizing for what she was wearing. Tae-jun was in the hallway outside the suite when she arrived. He was alone, which surprised her. She had expected the men in the dark suits, and he looked at her without expression for a moment when she stepped off the elevator. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He looked at her. Something in his face, the specific thing she'd been learning to read, the thing that moved beneath the composed surface, shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. "All right," he said. "How many people are in there?" "Whitfield. His lawyer from the card. 1 more. Security?" "1, stationed near the window." She nodded. "What are we walking in as?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we walking in as—" She paused, searching. "Business. As opposition. Or as something else?" He considered this for a moment. "We're walking in as the people who hold every card in this negotiation," he said. "That's sufficient." She nodded. "Then let's go." He opened the door. Carrie Whitfield was not what she'd expected. She had constructed a version of him from Tae-jun's description and Ethan's association and 8 months of lawyers' letters, corporate, smooth, the particular aggressive blandness of men who operated behind structural cover. The real Whitfield was smaller than this construction, not physically small. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with a full head of silver-gray hair and the kind of hands that had done physical work before they'd done boardroom work. He was 60-something. He had the specific confidence of someone who had built his way to where he was from something actual, which made him more dangerous than inherited confidence would have. He looked at Nyla and then at Taejun, and his face did the thing Ethan's face had done at the party. The rapid, involuntary recalculation of a man who was receiving information he had not expected. He was better at concealing it, but it was there. "Mr. Kang," he said. "Mr. Whitfield," Taejun said. He did not sit. He stood near the center of the suite's sitting area with his hands at his sides, and Nyla stood beside him, and neither of them moved toward the chairs that had been arranged for this meeting. "Ms. Brooks," Whitfield said, looking at her. "I'm glad you're here. I've been trying to speak with you directly for some time." "I know," she said. "I think there's been a mischaracterization of what our project—" "There hasn't," Taejun said. Whitfield looked at him. "There's been no mischaracterization," Taejun said. "Ms. Brooks understands the project. She understands the pressure campaign. She understands Ethan Holloway's involvement and the information that was used to design the approach to her specifically." He paused. "We didn't come here for a recharacterization. We came because you asked for a meeting and Ms. Brooks chose to be present for whatever you have to say." Whitfield's jaw moved. The lawyer beside him, a woman, 40s, the Charleston card, with the specific posture of someone who bills by the quarter hour and does not waste them, made a small movement that might have been reaching for a document. "The accounts will remain frozen," Taejun continued, "until the federal compliance reviews are complete. That timeline is not within my control or yours. The conditional agreements on the adjacent properties are void. The structural mechanism you built to convert the Clement Street block is gone." He said this the way he said everything, without heat, without performance, as fact. "What you have now is whatever personal assets survived Pacific Meridian's collapse, and a development project that has no viable path forward in this city." Whitfield was very still. "I can help you understand that clearly," Taejun said, "or you can spend the next 18 months testing whether that assessment is accurate." He paused. "That's the meeting." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Nyla. She held his gaze without expression and felt her heartbeat in her ears and her hands completely steady. "What do you want?" Whitfield said, to Taejun. "Nothing from you," Taejun said. "That's the point. I don't want a deal. I don't want a renegotiation. I want you to understand the situation correctly so you can make an informed decision about your next move." "And the building?" "Stays," Taejun said, "exactly as it is." Whitfield breathed. It was a controlled breath, the kind that came from practice. His hands, which had been flat on the armrests of his chair, turned slightly, just the wrists, and she saw the tell in it, the specific physical language of someone recalculating their position and not liking the new number. "You're Kang Tae-jun," he said. Not asking, confirming. "I've heard your name in 3 different cities." "That's reasonable," Tae-jun said. "The people who told me about you did not speak lightly." "Also reasonable." Whitfield looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at Nyla one more time, a different look than the one he'd given her when they walked in. Not assessment this time. Something closer to acknowledgement, like he was seeing her as the actual center of this, which she was, which she had always been, which the men who built the machine around her building had somehow continued to not quite believe was the point. He stood up. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Of course," Taejun said. Whitfield moved toward the suite's bedroom. The Charleston lawyer stood, gathered the document she had not been given the opportunity to deploy, and followed. The security man near the window shifted his weight and then went still again. Taejun turned to Nyla. She realized she had been holding herself at a particular tension for the last 15 minutes. Shoulders, jaw, the deep muscles in her back. And she had not been aware of it until it began, slowly, to release. "Is that it?" she said. "Not quite," he said quietly. "He'll make calls for 20 minutes. What he finds out in those calls will determine whether this is the end or the beginning of a longer problem." "What will he find out?" "Everything I've already told you. From people who will confirm it." He looked at her. "The calls are a formality. He already knows." She looked toward the closed bedroom door. "Then why did he take them?" "Because men like Whitfield don't accept conclusions handed to them," he said. "They need to arrive at the same destination independently, It's how they were built. She nodded slowly. She looked around the hotel suite. The neutral colors, the furniture that was expensive without being interesting. The window behind the security man showing a slice of the city's late afternoon. The rooftops and the water tower and the specific gray-blue light of San Francisco at 4 o'clock. Somewhere in that city was Clement Street and a bakery with her grandmother's photo above the espresso machine. "My grandmother," she said, "when she gave you bread. Did she know you were in trouble?" Taejun was quiet for a moment. "She knew enough," he said. "She didn't ask and I didn't tell. But she knew." "She always knew," Nyla said. "That was the thing about her. She didn't need to be told. She just looked at you and saw the shape of what you needed and gave it without making it a transaction." He was looking at her with the specific attention that she had learned over the past week was his most honest mode, the one under the managed stillness, the one that was paying complete attention with nothing filtered. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what she did." The bedroom door opened. Whitfield came back without his lawyer. He stood in the center of the suite with his hands at his sides and looked at Taejun with the expression of a man who had made his calls and arrived independently at the same destination. "The building stays," he said. "Yes," Taejun said. "Pacific Meridian is—" He stopped. "Gone." "Yes." Whitfield looked at Nyla. "I'm sorry for the pressure campaign. I don't say that lightly. I also don't expect it to land particularly well." He paused. "It's still true." She looked at him. "Thank you for saying it," she said. It was the same thing she'd said to Lorraine in the garden, and she meant it the same amount. Not as absolution, not as warmth, but as a receipt. Something received, noted, placed in the appropriate file. Whitfield nodded once. He put on his jacket. He left the suite without his lawyer and without the security man, who gathered himself quietly and followed. The Charleston lawyer emerged from the bedroom with her briefcase and looked at Nyla with an expression that was, briefly and completely unexpectedly, the expression of a woman looking at another woman with something adjacent to respect. Then she was gone too. The suite was empty. Nyla stood in the center of it with Taejun and the city light coming through the window and the specific silence of a room in which something large had just finished happening. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text. "This isn't over. You think Kang protects you forever? Ask him what he protected before he got to you. Ask him what happened to the last thing he tried to keep." She looked at it. She looked at Taejun. He was watching her. He had seen the text arrive and he had seen her face change, and he was looking at her now with an expression that she had not seen from him before. Something beneath the calm surface that was not managed, not controlled, not anything he had prepared. Something that had the quality of... She showed him the phone. He read the text. She watched his face while he read it, watched for the managed calm to hold, and it did, but underneath it something moved that she had no name for yet. His jaw set. His eyes went to the window and then came back to her. "Who sent this?" she said. "I don't know the number." "But you know who." He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculated quiet, the other kind. The kind that had weight in it. "It could be Ethan," he said. "It could be someone connected to Whitfield who didn't get the message as clearly as Whitfield did. It could be someone older." He paused. "Someone from before." "Before what?" He looked at her steadily. "Before this city." She held his gaze. The suite was still around them, the late afternoon light going flat against the window, the city noise muffled to a low frequency through the glass. She had a text on her phone from an unknown number telling her to ask this man what he had failed to protect, and she was standing in a hotel room with him 3 days into something she didn't have a word for yet, and she understood that she had arrived at a place where she could retreat or she could ask. She asked, "What happened to the last thing you tried to keep?" He did not look away. She had expected him to, had expected the managed surface to redirect, to defer, to produce the careful version of an answer that revealed nothing essential. He didn't. "Sit down," he said. They sat. The suite's neutral furniture, the window, the city going gray-blue behind it. He sat across from her with his hands open on his knees. Not the controlled stillness this time, but something more effortful. A man holding himself in a particular shape because the alternative was coming apart. 12 years ago, he said, I had a partner. His name was Jin Ho. We had built the East Coast operation together over 5 years, starting from nothing, the same way I started from nothing when I was 17. He stopped, breathed. Jinho had a family, a wife, a daughter who was 4 years old. He looked at his hands. There was a rival organization, a group I'd been removing from the markets we operated in. I had underestimated how far their reach went and how willing they were to go past business into personal. She did not speak. She held very still. They went after Jinho's family, he said. Not him. His family. He stopped again, longer this time. His wife survived. His daughter was not hurt physically, but Jinho... He stopped completely. He didn't survive, she said. He made it to the hospital, Taejun said. He died there. His daughter was 4 years old. She's 16 now. I pay for her education, her mother's house, everything they need. I have since the day he died. He looked up from his hands. But I could not give them back what they lost, and I knew, from that day I knew, that the kind of closeness that makes someone a target through you is something you cannot allow yourself. She understood. She understood the parking lot, the perfectly maintained distance, the suit that fit like armor, the quality of his stillness that was not coldness, but the specific discipline of a man who had learned that warmth had a cost he had already paid once in the worst possible currency. The text, she said. Is someone telling you that I am dangerous to be near, he said, and they are not entirely wrong. Are they entirely right? He looked at her. No. The organization that killed Jinho no longer exists. I spent 4 years making sure of that. The people who sent this text are working with old information about old vulnerabilities. My operation is different now. Cleaner, more insulated, more careful. He paused. But I cannot tell you that proximity to me carries no risk. I won't do that. She looked at her phone on the cushion beside her, at the text, at the unknown number with its specific intent. Not a warning issued out of concern for her, but a weapon pointed at the thing that was developing between her and this man, wielded by someone who understood that the way to destabilize Kang Tae-jun was not to threaten him directly, but to threaten what he was beginning to allow himself to want. She picked up the phone. She blocked the number. She set the phone face down on the cushion. Tae-jun watched her do this. Nyla, he said. I heard everything you said, she said. I'm not minimizing it. I understand what you're telling me, and I understand it's real. She looked at him. But whoever sent that text sent it because they thought it would make me run, and I don't respond well to being told what to do by people who are trying to use me to hurt you. He was very still. I'm also 30 years old, she said. I've spent 6 years being told by people who were supposed to love me that I was making the wrong choices by not making the choices they wanted me to make. I'm done letting other people's agendas determine my directions. She held his gaze. I'm not naive. I'm not making this decision without understanding the cost. I'm making it because I looked at the cost and decided. Silence. He said, You're certain. I'm certain I want dinner, she said. I'm certain about the rest as it comes. Something happened in his face. Not the shadow of a smile this time, not the corner of the mouth thing. Something more complete than that. Something that arrived without management and stayed for a moment before he had the chance to regulate it back. She saw it, and she filed it in the place where she was keeping the things that were true about him. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They left the hotel. The dinner was not that night. It was 2 weeks later, after the compliance investigations moved into their formal phase and Carrie Whitfield flew back to Atlanta, and Ethan Holloway retained a lawyer and began the process of negotiating the consequences of his involvement in Pacific Meridian, which would take 14 months and cost him the remainder of the fortune he'd spent 3 years constructing. Priya had the engagement quietly dissolved by the end of the month. Marcus texted Nyla a single emoji, a small red flag, and she sent back a laughing face, and they left it there. The dinner was at a Japanese restaurant in the Richmond district, 8 blocks from the bakery, that Tae-jun had been going to alone for 3 years. He had told her this on the phone 2 days before. She had said, 3 years and you've been going alone. He had said, until now. She had set the phone down after they hung up and stood in her flour-dusted kitchen at 10:30 at night and felt the specific warmth of something that didn't have a name being confirmed. She wore jeans and a dark blue shirt and her grandmother's watch. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall, a habit she was learning that had no explanation required, And he stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and she thought, this is real. This is actually real. I need to remember every detail of this. They ate for 2 hours. She told him about the bakery's first year, the months when she wasn't sure the rent would clear, the week the refrigeration failed and she lost $200 of butter, the first time the line went out the door and around the corner and she stood in the back and cried with her hand over her mouth so her employee wouldn't hear. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely. And when she finished, he said, "Your grandmother would have been proud." And she said, "I know. I think about that every day." And neither of them said anything else about it because it was enough. He told her about the early years of the organization, not the mechanics, not the specifics she didn't need and hadn't asked for, but the shape of it, the decisions that had compounded into the thing it became. He told her about learning English from television at 17, from a library 2 blocks from Clement Street where a librarian had not once asked him why he was always there. He told her about the first legitimate business he'd purchased at 24 with money that had been earned in ways he had since moved away from, a dry cleaning operation in Flushing that he still owned that was now managed by the son of the original owner. He told her these things in the particular way of a man who was not used to telling them and was finding that the telling cost less than he'd expected. She paid for dinner. She had decided this in advance, and when the bill came, she reached for it, and he looked at her and she said, "My turn. We'll negotiate the rest as we go." And he let her, which she appreciated more than she would have been able to explain. Outside the restaurant, the Richmond district was doing its nighttime thing. Foot traffic thinning, restaurant lights spilling onto the sidewalk, the specific urban quiet that settled in after 9 on a weeknight. They walked the 8 blocks to the bakery without planning to, following the direction they were both already facing. She unlocked the front door. She said, "Come in," and he came in. And she turned on the case lights, but not the overheads, so the bakery was lit softly from below. The pastries in the cases and the flour on the prep counter and the photo of May Brooks above the espresso machine. He stood inside the door and looked at the photo. She let him look. After a moment, he said, "She's younger there than I remember her. I only knew her for 4 months. In my memory, she's larger, the way people who feed you become larger." "She was like that in person," Nyla said. "She filled a room without trying." Yes. She went behind the counter and started the espresso machine by habit, the way she did every morning, the way she would do tomorrow morning and the morning after. She made 2 coffees. She brought them out and set his on the counter in front of the stool, and he sat down on it and wrapped his hands around the cup, and she stood on the other side, the way she'd stood across from him the first afternoon he came in, except that now she knew the shape of who was sitting there. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I've spent a long time," she paused, working out how to say it accurately. "I've spent a long time believing that the reason I was alone was something inherent, something I was doing wrong or failing to be. And I understand now that some of that was Ethan, and some of it was my family, and some of it was just—" She stopped. "The story I was telling myself because I didn't have a better one." He was listening. "I'm not alone because I was too difficult," she said. "I was alone because I was in the wrong rooms with the wrong people, and I kept waiting for them to see me instead of leaving." She looked at him. "I'm not waiting anymore." "No," he said. "You're not. I want to be clear that I know who I am. I run a bakery. I wake up at 4:30, and I smell like flour until 8 at night, and I drive a Honda with a cracked dashboard thing, and my family is—" She gestured, "complicated, charitably. I am not—" She stopped. "I'm not glamorous. I'm not what people assume someone like you would have beside him." "Someone like me," he said. "You know what I mean. I know what people assume someone like me would have beside him," he said. "I've spent 12 years not having anyone beside me because the calculation never came out correctly." He held his coffee. "You walked up to a stranger in a parking lot and offered him $40 and a loyalty card and told him exactly what you needed, and you did it with more honesty than most people manage in a lifetime of conversation. That is not a small thing." He paused. "That is not common." She looked at him. He looked back. 4 punches left on the card," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. She reached under the counter and pulled out the loyalty card. She had kept it. She had not examined why she had kept it. She had simply put it in the drawer and left it there. And she set it on the counter between them. He picked it up. He looked at it. He put it in his jacket pocket with the specific care of someone storing something that was going to stay there. That was the night it became real. Not official. Official came later. quietly, without ceremony, because neither of them were ceremony people, Nyla for 30 years of reasons, and Tai Jun for 12. But Real arrived that night in the bakery with the case lights on, and the espresso machine's ambient heat, and Mae Brooks looking down from the photograph with that slight squint that had always meant she was deciding something about the world in front of her. The weeks that followed had their own texture. Tae Jun came to the bakery 3 times a week. He always sat at the counter, always ordered the same coffee, and over the course of the first month worked his way systematically through every pastry in the case with the focused attention of a man conducting a serious evaluation. He gave his opinions without being asked. The morning bun needed more orange zest. The almond croissant was better than anything he'd had in France. The sesame roll was correct in every particular and should never be changed. She told him the orange zest note was good, and she'd consider it, and she was not changing the sesame roll. He said he didn't expect her to. She said good. Marcus came in one Saturday and found Tae Jun at the counter and sat down beside him, and they talked for an hour about basketball, which neither of them followed closely, and property values in the Richmond district, which both of them followed closely. And when Marcus left, he texted Nyla, "Okay, I have more questions, but also I think he's good. Preliminary finding, subject to revision." She texted back, "Noted." He sent the small red flag emoji again. She sent back a heart. The compliance investigations took their course. Ethan's lawyers negotiated. Pacific Meridian's accounts remained frozen through the winter and into the spring. And the resolution, when it came, cost Ethan the investment he'd put in, and the reputation he'd built on top of it, and the network of relationships that had depended on other people believing he was who he'd performed being. Priya rebuilt more quietly. She went back to the law degree she'd set aside, got a position at a mid-sized firm in Oakland, and appeared at a Brooks family gathering 6 months later with the particular composure of a woman who had been badly fooled and had decided to use it rather than hide it. Nyla sat beside her at that gathering, and they talked for the first time, really talked. And Priya said, "I should have asked more questions." And Nyla said, "He was designed to make questions feel unnecessary." And Priya looked at her and said, "You're the only person who said anything to me about him that wasn't just, 'I told you so.'" And Nyla said, "I've had enough of those to know what they cost." Lorraine did not become a different person. This was the thing Nyla understood slowly over the months that followed. That the garden party and Tae Jun's words and the specific public accounting of that evening had not transformed her aunt into something else. Lorraine remained who she was, a woman who measured people by metrics she'd chosen decades ago and had not fully re-examined. But she was quieter in her measurement. She directed it less at Nyla. She called once, in February, to ask about the bakery's expansion plan she'd read about in a neighborhood publication, and the call lasted 11 minutes and was entirely civil. And at the end of it, Lorraine said, "Your grandmother would be proud," which was the same thing Tai Jun had said, and which landed differently from Lorraine because it cost her more. Nyla said, "I know, I think about that every day," and she meant it both times. The expansion Lorraine had read about was small. Neela had taken the space adjacent to the bakery that had been a phone repair shop and had spent 3 months gut renovating it into a second prep kitchen and a 6-table seating area. She had done this with her own savings and a loan she'd taken at better terms than she'd expected, because the building's financial standing had been, quietly and without announcement, improved by the resolution of the Pacific Meridian situation and the stabilization of the entire block. Tae Jun had not offered to pay for the expansion. She had not asked him to. They had not discussed it at all. What he had done was make sure the block was stable, the adjacent properties were held by managers who had no interest in selling, and the street-level environment around the bakery was what it had always been. A neighborhood in the specific sense, the kind where people walked their dogs and knew the shop owners by name, and where someone opening a seating area with 6 tables would have an immediate customer base of people who had been wanting exactly that for years. She held the opening on a Thursday morning in March. She put out chairs and made more bread than she needed and opened the door at 7, and by 9 every table was full, and there was a line outside. Marcus was there. Her mother was there, sitting at the table nearest the window with the particular expression of a woman in the process of understanding something she had been slow to see. 2 of Neela's employees had been working with her for 3 years, and she had promoted both of them, and they were working the counter with the ease of people who had earned their ground. Tae Jun arrived at 9:45. He came in without announcement, the way he always came in, and found the only open seat, which was the stool at the counter, and sat down. She was behind the counter. She set a coffee in front of him. She did not say anything. He looked around the space, the 6 tables full, the line outside. The photograph she'd hung on the new wall that included May Brooks in 1989 and 2 others, earlier, that she'd found in a box in her mother's closet. He looked at all of it. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He set the loyalty card on the counter. She looked at it. The 6 original punches. The 4 she'd added over the preceding months. 1 for each of the first 4 times he'd come in after the hotel. A joke that had become a habit that had become something else. 10 punches total. 1 over the threshold for the free coffee. She took the card. She held it. "You're past the limit," she said. "I know," he said. "You're owed a free coffee." "I'm aware." She looked at him across the counter. The morning light was coming through the front window at a low angle, the specific March light that was pale and without warmth but very clear, and in it she could see the scar on his jaw and the slight furrow in his brow and the dark eyes that paid attention to everything and had been paying attention to her, specifically for 7 months, without once looking away when it would have been easier. She put the loyalty card back under the counter. "On the house," she said. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the line was still moving. The 6 tables were cycling. People finishing, people arriving, the specific rhythm of a room that had found its purpose. One of her employees was calling out an order. Someone at the window table laughed at something. The espresso machine made its ambient sound. Flour on the counter. The smell of the second proof coming through from the back kitchen. The whole early morning weight of the thing she had built pressing gently against her like something solid. She looked at the photograph of May Brooks above the machine. May Brooks, who had kept a stool beside the front counter and given bread and coffee to a frightened 17-year-old for 4 months without asking who he was, who had said that feeding someone was the most honest thing you could offer, who had left a building and a set of recipes and a way of standing in a room that her granddaughter had been inheriting and re-inheriting for 30 years, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. Nyla thought, "I think I understand now." She thought, "You built something that lasted long enough to find its way back to you." She thought, "I'm going to do the same." Taejun finished his coffee. He set the cup down and looked at her with the specific look she had learned over 7 months was his most honest one. The one that was not managed, not calculated, not armor. And she looked back with the specific steadiness of a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to be seen. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He left. She turned back to the counter and picked up the next order and called it back to the kitchen. And the morning continued with its own momentum, the line and the tables and the bread coming out in its time, and Nyla Brooks stood in the middle of what she had made and felt, without irony and without reservation, the particular warmth of a life that had found its own shape. Not because someone had given it to her, because she had held on to it long enough for it to become undeniable. Outside on Clement Street, the city was doing what it always did, moving, building, breaking, rebuilding, the constant low hum of people trying to make something that lasted. And the bakery sat inside all of that with its lights on and its door open and the smell of bread reaching all the way to the sidewalk. The same smell it had always been, the one that got into the body and stayed, the one that said, "Someone here knows what you need, and they're not going to make you ask twice." That was the inheritance. That was what it had always been. And it was enough.